The noon sun burned hot over the dusty main street as the widow stepped out from the mercantile, her small sack of flour clutched tight in one hand, the other resting on the head of her gray wolf. The town square was louder than usual, voices carrying a rough edge, and as she glanced toward the commotion, she saw him, taller than any man there, shoulders broad as the stockade post he was chained to. Heavy iron links bound his wrists and ankles, the cuffs biting into skin rubbed raw. His beard was thick, his hair unkempt, his face shadowed beneath a furrowed brow, and yet his eyes, when they lifted, were startlingly clear, like mountain ice. The townsfolk shouted names at him: murderer, savage, beast. A boy threw a stone, and though the man didn't flinch, her wolf bristled, hackles rising. The animal pulled from her side, slipping through the milling crowd, ignoring their startled curses. The widow called once, but the wolf didn't look back. It went straight to the chained man, circling once before lying down at his feet, its body stretched protectively between him and the jeering crowd. A ripple of unease passed through the onlookers. "That's a dangerous creature, miss," someone called. "Best call it off." But she didn't. She watched the mountain man glance down at the wolf, his expression unreadable, one slow breath lifting his chest, as if the presence of the animal had shifted something deep inside him. A burly man in a stained apron, Tommy Beckett, the blacksmith, stepped forward with a length of iron rod, swinging it toward the wolf to drive it away. In an instant, the wolf's low growl rolled like thunder, freezing the man mid-strike. The sheriff pushed through the crowd then, his spurs ringing on the hard-packed dirt. "Whose wolf is this?" he barked. Her voice felt strange in her throat, but she made it carry. "Mine." The sheriff's eyes narrowed, flicking from her to the man in chains. "You'd best get it away, ma'am, before it decides to turn on folks." She didn't move. Neither did the wolf. Something about the scene, her animal refusing to leave, the stranger's stillness, made her chest tighten. She knew trouble when she saw it. And yet, as the heat shimmered in the air and the crowd muttered about danger, she found herself stepping forward instead of away. The flour sack pressed against her ribs, her voice low but certain as she met the sheriff's eye. "Why is he chained?" The sheriff's jaw flexed, as if weighing whether she even deserved an answer. "Caught him up in the high pass," he said at last, his tone flat. "3 men dead. Some say he killed them for their mules. Others say he tore through a mining camp for sport. Either way, he's staying here till Judge Ralston rides through." His gaze shifted to the wolf still lying at the man's feet. "And that beast of yours seems to think he's worth protecting. Makes me wonder about you." The widow ignored the jab, her eyes moving between the sheriff and the man in chains. The mountain man didn't speak, didn't blink, just studied her the way a hawk might watch a lone rabbit on an open plain. Quiet, measuring, unreadable. Around them the crowd was restless, muttering about dangerous men and bad omens. She could feel their stares crawling over her back, and yet her focus stayed on the 2 creatures before her, one bound in iron, the other bound only by loyalty. The wolf's ears twitched at her voice. "Come," she called softly, the way she had 100 times before, the command that usually brought him to her side no matter what. But today, he didn't move. Instead, he angled his body tighter against the man's boots, his eyes on her with something like a warning. "No. This one stays." Murmurs rose from the crowd. "Look at that," someone whispered. "Wolf's picking a side." Another man laughed nervously. "Better hope it ain't the wrong one." The sheriff took a step forward, his hand brushing the butt of his revolver. "You want me to drag it away, lady? Might get ugly?" She stepped between them before he could reach, her chin lifting in a way that startled even her. "Number, he's made his choice." The sheriff stared at her for a beat, then spat in the dirt and turned to address the blacksmith. "Tommy, get him some water before he rots in this sun. Judge'll want him alive." The widow felt the heat radiating from the packed earth beneath her boots, the dry air catching in her throat. She looked once more at the mountain man. The wind shifted just enough to bring her the scent of leather, sweat, and dust. His eyes didn't waver from hers, and for a heartbeat, she swore the faintest curve touched his mouth. Not mockery, not menace, but something quieter. Gratitude. It was then she understood. Her wolf hadn't just chosen him. Somehow, without a single word spoken, he'd chosen her too. The sheriff leaned one shoulder against the hitching post, chewing on a toothpick like he had all the time in the world. "You want him?" he asked, not loud enough for the whole crowd, but just enough for her to hear. The words landed like a dare. She frowned, her hand brushing the worn fabric of her dress where her wedding ring once sat. Until that morning, when she'd slipped it into her pocket for reasons she still didn't understand. "And what would it cost?" she asked, trying to keep her voice even. His gaze drifted toward her hand, and his smirk deepened. "Judge ain't here yet. Law says he's mine till then. But law don't pay for feed, and I got no patience for men who eat and don't work. I figure a woman like you might have something worth trading." She knew what he meant, and her stomach turned. But before she could answer, the wolf growled low and deep, the sound cutting through the hot air like a blade. The mountain man's head lifted a fraction, his eyes narrowing on the sheriff with a warning that didn't require words. For a moment, the tension coiled so tight that even the onlookers fell silent, as though waiting for a shot to ring out. The sheriff chuckled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Easy now. I ain't asking for nothing untoward. Just saying, some things are worth more than coin, and your wolf there seems to think this man's one of 'em." She reached into her pocket and drew out the ring, the gold dulled by years of wear, the engraving inside, James and Lila forever, still clear enough to read. The sheriff's eyebrows rose. "That your husband's?" She nodded once. "He's gone. But this is the only thing I have left that could match the price of a life." The sheriff's smirk faltered, just slightly, as he weighed the offer. "You're a fool," he muttered, but his fingers closed around the ring all the same. "He's yours, but if he kills again, it's on your head." Without another word, he pulled a key from his vest pocket, the sound of the lock clicking open sharp in the stillness. The iron shackles clattered to the ground, and the mountain man straightened slowly, rubbing his raw wrists. He didn't thank her. He didn't speak. But the way he stepped to her side, close enough that his shadow folded over hers, was enough. And when the wolf pressed his head gently against her hand, she realized the trade had bound her to more than one soul. The crowd that had gathered to see the spectacle of the caged mountain man didn't disperse right away. They watched with a mix of curiosity, wariness, and disappointment, as though the ending hadn't been bloody enough for their taste. The sun hung low over the rooftops, bathing the dusty main street in a molten light that made every shadow stretch long and thin. She could feel the heat radiating off the man beside her, though he moved with the controlled stillness of a predator gauging his surroundings. The wolf kept pace on his other side, ears twitching at every sound. No one dared step close, but she could feel their eyes digging into her back. "This way," she said quietly, her voice trembling despite her best effort. She didn't know if he would follow. Didn't know if freeing him had been an act of mercy or a reckless invitation to danger. But when she stepped forward, his boots scraped softly against the packed earth as he fell into step beside her. The chains now lay coiled in the dirt behind them like a shed skin, the last of their rattles fading into the hum of late afternoon. Her hands gripped the strap of her satchel tightly, her mind racing. Where would she take him? What would she even say? The air between them was heavy with unspoken questions, but the wolf seemed to bridge the silence, brushing against her leg in a gesture that felt almost protective. Halfway down the street, a drunkard staggered out of the saloon, nearly colliding with them. His bleary gaze sharpened when it landed on the mountain man, and he barked out a laugh. "Well, I'll be damned. They let the beast out." His words were slurred, but the taunt carried enough weight to make a few bystanders snicker. The mountain man didn't so much as glance at him, but his presence shifted, his shoulders tightening, his jaw clenching. The wolf's fur bristled, and its growl was low and warning. She stepped forward quickly, her arm brushing his in an unplanned but deliberate act, a silent plea for him to keep walking. To her surprise, he did. The saloon door swung shut behind them, muting the sound of laughter, and they reached the edge of town where the fields began. There, with the last light of day painting the world in copper and shadow, he finally spoke, his voice deep and rough from disuse. "Why?" Just that one word, but it rooted her in place. She swallowed hard, meeting his gaze for the first time without the bars between them. "Because no one should be left in chains," she said. His eyes searched hers for a long, unreadable moment before he nodded once, as though that was enough. Then, together, they stepped into the open land, the wolf leading the way. They walked in silence until the last edge of the sun dipped below the hills, leaving the prairie brushed in blue shadow and the first glint of starlight. The air cooled quickly, each breath turning visible in front of them. She kept glancing at the mountain man from the corner of her eye, noting how he moved. Silent, watchful, as if the land itself spoke to him. The wolf ranged ahead, then circled back, ears pricked, nose twitching as if checking every scent for threat. Finally, the dim outline of her small homestead came into view. A weathered cabin of pine logs with a lean-to stable attached. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney, carrying the smell of wood and simmering broth. She hesitated before leading him toward it. It was one thing to free him from chains. It was another to invite him into her world. But when she saw the stiffness in his gait, the way his wrists bore raw, red marks from the irons, she pushed the hesitation aside. "You can rest here," she said quietly, stopping at the porch. He looked at the cabin for a long moment, then at her, as though measuring the weight of her offer. Finally, he gave a slow nod and ducked inside. The wolf padded after him without hesitation. She lit a lantern, its warm glow spilling across the single room. Table, wood stove, narrow bed tucked into the corner. He stayed near the doorway, scanning every wall, every window, his instincts clearly still wound tight. She poured a bowl of stew from the pot on the stove and slid it toward him. He didn't reach for it immediately, his gaze fixed on her as if trying to understand her angle. When he finally took it, his movements were slow, deliberate, and his eyes softened almost imperceptibly at the first bite. The wolf settled at his feet with a sigh. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of hooves. She froze. That was no neighborly visit, not at this hour. His head lifted instantly, spoon forgotten, eyes narrowing toward the door. The wolf was on its feet in an instant, hackles raised. She crossed to the window and peered out, her heart stuttering when she saw 3 riders cresting the hill, moving fast, their shapes little more than dark blots against the night. "Trouble?" he asked, his voice quiet but edged. She swallowed hard. "The men from town. The ones who kept you in chains." For a long beat, they stood in the stillness, the only sound the wolf's low growl and the faint creak of saddle leather drawing closer. Then he set the bowl down, his expression shifting into something fierce and unyielding. "Bolt the door," he said, and she realized that whatever they had unleashed by freeing him was about to be tested tonight. The pounding of hooves grew louder until it swallowed the quiet night, shaking the frost from the porch beams. She had just thrown the bolt across the door when the first heavy knock rattled the wood, followed by a voice dripping with mockery. "Evenin', widow. Heard you brought yourself some company." The mountain man stood in the center of the room, shadowed in the lantern light, his broad shoulders filling the small space. His eyes flicked to the wolf, who stood rigid by the door, teeth bared, a low, constant growl rumbling from its chest. Another pounding knock shook the cabin, and this time it was followed by the thud of a boot kicking against the lower panel. She flinched, glancing at him. "If they get in—" "They won't," he said flatly, stepping forward. He pulled the door brace from the wall, angled it against the handle, and without another word, grabbed a length of chain from his belt, the same chain they'd once used to bind him, and wrapped it tight around the door latch. Outside, the riders laughed. "Come on, widow. No need to be shy. Hand over the animal and the man. You know what he's worth." His jaw tightened, and for the first time she saw something dangerous in his eyes. Not the wild, unpredictable danger the town whispered about, but the kind that was calculated, honed, and utterly unafraid. He motioned her toward the corner near the bed. "Stay there," he ordered. The wolf padded closer to him, its golden eyes locked on the door. The next sound was a scraping, metal against wood, before one of the men outside tried to force the latch. The mountain man moved silently to the wall, reaching for a heavy iron poker leaning beside the stove. In the glow of the lantern, he looked like a figure carved from the very mountains, immovable, unshaken. "Last chance," the voice outside called, this time sharper. "Open up, or we take the door down." His reply was quiet, almost calm, but it carried through the wood like steel. "Try." For a moment there was silence. Then the crash came. The door shuddered under the weight of the impact, the chain biting into the latch, holding firm. The wolf lunged at the noise, barking ferociously, its voice deep and threatening. She pressed herself against the wall, her pulse hammering as the second crash hit, harder this time, splintering the top hinge. He didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped into position, raising the iron poker in one hand while his other rested briefly on the wolf's back. "On my word," he murmured. Outside, the riders prepared for a third, final assault, unaware that the man they had once chained was now waiting to meet them on his own terms. The third crash split the top hinge, the door buckling inward, cold air pouring into the room like a wave of ice. Before it could fall completely, the mountain man gave the wolf a sharp nod. The animal lunged through the gap with a guttural snarl, its massive body hitting the first rider square in the chest. The man's shout was lost in the chaos as the wolf's teeth clamped onto his sleeve, dragging him from the saddle into the snow. The mountain man followed in a blur, kicking the door open with a force that snapped the remaining hinge. The iron poker swung upward, catching the second rider across the forearm before he could draw his pistol. The weapon clattered into the snow, and the rider tumbled from his horse. She watched from the doorway, her hands gripping the frame, the breath in her lungs frozen in terror and awe. The man she had seen so often in chains now moved like a force of nature, calm, deliberate, deadly. One of the riders scrambled to his feet, swinging wildly, but the mountain man caught his fist mid-air, twisting until the man cried out and dropped to his knees. Without hesitation, he drove his boot into the man's shoulder, sending him sprawling back into the snow. Another attacker circled behind, reaching for a rope on his saddle, but the wolf was faster, breaking free from its first victim to leap at the man's thigh. The rider screamed, falling back into the frost. The last man, seeing the tide turn, kicked his heels into his horse and bolted into the tree line, snow exploding behind him. The wolf gave chase but stopped at the edge of the woods when the mountain man gave a sharp whistle. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the heavy breathing of the defeated men and the wolf's low growl. The mountain man stooped, grabbing one of the attacker's discarded rifles and tossing it into the snow well out of reach. His eyes scanned the clearing, sharp and calculating, before settling on her. "You hurt?" he asked simply. She shook her head, though her pulse still thundered in her ears. Behind him, the men they'd driven off were groaning, nursing bruises and cuts, their horses skittish from the fight. The mountain man didn't bother tying them up. He simply leaned down, meeting one of their frightened gazes. "Tell them," he said quietly, his voice carrying more weight than any shout. "If they come again, I won't be this gentle." The rider nodded frantically. Then, as snowflakes drifted down through the cold night, the man and his wolf turned back toward her, stepping into the doorway, not as a prisoner or a fugitive, but as something far more dangerous to anyone who tried to take her away. The fire inside the cabin hissed as the mountain man shoved the door back into place, bracing it with the heavy table. The wolf padded in behind him, its fur dusted with snow, eyes still burning from the fight. She stood there, still trembling, unsure if the cold or the adrenaline was to blame. He didn't speak at first, just checked the latch on the back window, then retrieved a cloth and began wiping the blood from the wolf's muzzle. The silence felt heavy, but not hostile, like he was thinking through what had just happened. Finally, he glanced at her, his voice low. "They weren't here by chance. Someone sent them." Her breath caught. "Why?" He shook his head. "Could be the same ones who chained me. Could be someone else who knows you're alone here. Either way, this place isn't safe anymore." She swallowed hard, her mind racing. The cabin was all she had left of her husband, the only walls that had ever kept her warm in winter. "I can't just leave," she whispered. He straightened, eyes narrowing as though measuring her resolve. "You can. You just don't want to." He turned to the hearth, adding another log to the flames. The sound of it catching filled the tense air. "There's an old trail north," he said. "Snow's deep, but it'll cover our tracks. My place is there. No one comes without my say-so." She shook her head, fear and stubbornness warring in her chest. "I don't even know you." His jaw flexed. "You know enough. You saw what I did to the ones outside. You saw what the wolf would do for me. I'm offering you that same protection." Outside, the wind had risen, carrying with it the faint sound of hooves, retreating, but not gone. He glanced toward the sound, then back to her. "They'll send more. And next time, they'll bring more guns." She shivered, imagining the same fight, but with more riders, more fists, more cold steel. She wanted to protest again, but his gaze softened. Not in pity, but in something steadier. Something that felt like truth. "I don't care what they've told you about me," he said quietly. "You're not staying here alone. Not while I'm breathing." The wolf, as if understanding the promise in his tone, stepped forward and rested its head against her thigh. The weight of it felt strangely grounding. Her resistance wavered, the warmth of the animal's fur seeping into her frozen resolve. "If I go," she murmured, "I take what I can carry." He gave a single, firm nod. "Then we leave at first light." The fire cracked, sending shadows climbing the log walls as the cabin settled into a tense, uneasy quiet. Two strangers bound now by danger, and perhaps something more. Dawn broke pale and brittle over the valley, the snow glowing faintly under a thin veil of morning mist. She had not slept. Every creak of the cabin walls, every snap of ice outside kept her eyes open. The mountain man was already up, moving with quiet purpose, packing supplies into a worn leather satchel. His wolf lay near the door, watching him with sharp, unblinking eyes, as if sensing the journey ahead. "Bundle up," he said without looking at her, his voice steady but clipped. She layered every piece of clothing she owned, pulling her late husband's heavy coat over her shoulders. It smelled faintly of smoke and cedar, but the comfort was fleeting. Outside, the cold was sharper than a blade, the air burning her lungs as they stepped into the snow. The mountain man led, his broad frame breaking a path through the drifts while she followed in his tracks. The wolf padded ahead, nose low, ears twitching at every whisper of wind. They moved quickly, each breath visible in the freezing air, their footsteps muffled in the white stillness. The trail wound upward, through a narrow pass hemmed in by jagged pines. She glanced back once, half expecting to see riders cresting the ridge, but the valley lay empty, silent but for the groan of the trees under their snowy burden. Still, unease gnawed at her. "How far?" she asked, voice muffled through her scarf. "Half a day if the weather holds," he replied without turning. "Longer if it turns." His words were barely carried away by the wind before the wolf froze ahead of them, its hackles rising. The mountain man's hand went to the rifle slung across his back. "Stay behind me," he murmured, his tone like iron. The wolf growled low, the sound rumbling through the quiet like distant thunder. From the trees to their right, a figure emerged, a man on foot, bundled in furs, his face half covered by a scarf. He carried no visible weapon, but there was something in the way his eyes lingered on her that made her grip her coat tighter. "Morning," the stranger called, voice friendly enough to make it feel wrong. "Didn't mean to startle you." The mountain man didn't lower his rifle. "Trail's not safe. Best head the other way." The stranger smiled thinly, his gaze slipping again toward her before he nodded and stepped aside. But even as they passed, she felt his eyes on her back, a weight that followed long after he was gone. The mountain man's pace quickened, his jaw set. "We keep moving," he said. "No stops." "Not until we reach my place." And as they pushed deeper into the wilderness, the wolf never stopped glancing over its shoulder. By the time they reached the mountain man's cabin, the light was fading into a deep blue dusk, and the first flakes of a new storm had begun to fall. The place was built solid into the hillside, logs thick and darkened with years of weather, smoke curling from the chimney like a quiet promise of warmth. She staggered inside, the heat from the stone hearth hitting her like a wave, thawing the ache in her bones. The wolf padded in last, shaking snow from its fur before curling near the fire, eyes still sharp and restless. The mountain man moved with practiced speed, securing the door, shuttering the windows, checking the rifle and the hatchet he kept by the frame. "We're not alone out here," he said quietly, and she knew he meant the stranger on the trail, and anyone who might have been with him. They ate quickly, the food hot and simple, and for a moment she allowed herself to believe the danger might pass. But then the wolf's ears pricked, its head lifting toward the door, a low growl humming in its chest. The mountain man rose, motioning her toward the back wall where a small crawl space opened into a dugout storage room. "Get in there and don't come out unless I tell you." She hesitated, fear clenching her stomach. "What about you?" His eyes softened for the briefest moment. "I'll be right outside that door. You'll hear my voice." The knock came just as she slipped inside the dark space. It wasn't a polite knock. It was hard, slow, deliberate, like a warning. Through the cracks in the wall, she could see the door open slightly, the mountain man's broad silhouette framed against the snow. The stranger from the trail stood there, 2 other men behind him, both armed. "We've come for the girl," the stranger said, his tone almost casual. "You've got something that belongs to us." The mountain man's voice was cold as steel. "She belongs to no one." Without warning, one of the men lunged, and the sound of a rifle cracking split the air. The wolf leapt, a blur of teeth and muscle, driving one man into the snow while the mountain man swung the hatchet at the second. The fight was short but brutal. Boots scraping on the wood floor, snarls and shouts mixing with the storm outside. When it was over, the intruders lay in the snow, alive but beaten, their weapons kicked far away. The mountain man shut the door, bolted it, and let out a long breath. He turned toward her hiding place, calling softly, "It's over. You can come out." When she stepped into the firelight, he reached for her hands, still trembling, and held them like they were the most sacred thing he'd ever been given.